Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second annual International eConference on Atheism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, something to keep in mind is that GCRR is not interested in converting or deconverting anybody from any particular belief system. We are strictly an academic institution, and we seek to approach the discussion of God and suffering purely from a scholastic standpoint, whether that standpoint is theistic, atheistic, or something else entirely. Now, that's actually, in fact, one of the greatest things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world with a whole bunch of different backgrounds and traditions, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. Also, as a special gift to everybody, all you have to do is go to gcrr.org, our website, and look up our newest publication called God and Horrendous Suffering. And with that, all you have to do is scroll down to the bottom, and you can download a special sneak preview of the book by clicking the preview button. And if you end up wanting to purchase that book, we do recommend that you go through the GCRR website because our prices are a lot lower. But also, we're going to give you 15% off more than on the retail price. All you have to do is use the promo code SUFFERING, and that's all in lowercase. Use the promo code SUFFERING at checkout. And with that said, I want to introduce you to a very good friend of mine and our next presenter, Ron Buenaventura, and allow me to share my screen so I can give a proper introduction. And it looks like we actually had some more people join us, so give me a second. All right, now I can give a proper introduction. So Ron Buenaventura is a first-year grad student in philosophy at Ryerson University, and his topic today is called Dystheism as a response to Plantinga's free will defense. His research interests are mainly in ancient philosophy, metaethics, and the philosophy of religion. And you can actually read some of his research papers at his personal website, ronbuenaventura.academia.edu. And we're very happy to have him here, an up-and-coming scholar. Now, thank you so much for being here, Ron. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you for having me, Darren, and thank you for having my presentation under the auspices of GCRR. So as Darren just noted, my presentation is on Dystheism as a response to Plantinga's free will defense. And just allow me to share my screens because I have slides to basically supplement my presentation. Okay. I'd just like to confirm that everyone can see this full screen.
You are good to go.
All right, awesome. So immediately right off the bat, I actually want to put a little asterisk on what I mean by dystheism here. So I think that my response to Plantinga's free will defense will be dependent on a certain kind of reading of evil, which is a little bit of a spoiler alert for what I'm going to discuss later on in the presentation. But my response of dystheism, which is essentially, more spoilers, the attitude or the belief that God isn't necessarily a wholly good God, i.e. he's not omnibenevolent, will depend on a certain kind of reading of evil, which I will go into later. But just to preface the presentation, I ought to discuss about where Plantinga's free will defense even arises from, and this is coming primarily from the early formulations of basically what's known as the logical problem of evil. And what we have, or what I have here, is an extremely rough version of that. Notice how it's V1 and logical problem of evil in a nutshell, to explain the nutshell there part. So it's not actually too much. It's just 4 simple premises initially, starting with the premise that God is an omnipotent being and that he's all-powerful. The second premise that God is an omnibenevolent being is that he's all and only good. The third premise that God is an omniscient being and that he's all-knowing, but that nevertheless evil exists. And philosophers like J.L. Mackie basically say that there's a logical contradiction here that arises by having all these 4 premises to being true at the same time. Well, in response, Plantinga initially basically says something along the following. the premises that we've been given, the explicit premises that we've been given in that first version of the logical problem of evil, themselves alone, they aren't enough to establish a logical contradiction. In other words, Plantinga wants us to uncover the sort of implicit, unstated assumptions that are being made in regards to those explicit premises that leads us to the logical contradiction between the omniqualities of God and the existence of evil. So, in other words, Plantinga demands that we basically just add more premises for the argument to succeed or be valid in this scenario. It needs to be more explicit. And so we have another version of the logical problem of evil, which is a lot more detailed and a lot more in-depth with what it purports to say. So from our first version of the logical problem of evil, again, we'll just combine the three first premises to just say that, pardon me, God is an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and an omniscient being. These are going to be the omniqualities that I'll refer to throughout the presentation. And then we can move on for a bit of detail about what those three omniqualities mean, starting with the first. So an omnipotent being has the power to prevent evil from coming into existence. Then we can move on to omnibenevolence and say something about that an omnibenevolent being wants to prevent all evils. Before moving on to lastly the subpremise of omniscience, that an omniscient being knows all the possible ways that evil could come about and how they can be prevented. And then we can make the move by basically combining all of those subpremises together and make it an explicit premise, which is what Plantinga wants, that a being that firstly has the power to prevent all evils, secondly wants to prevent all evils, and thirdly knows all the ways evil could come about and how they can be prevented, necessarily would prevent that evil. And so now we've got a lot more of a more cogent argument here, but then we still have our logical contradiction. Now it's made explicit. Evil still exists. So what gives? It is important to basically say here that this formulation of the logical problem of evil can actually be used as a sort of denying the consequent modus tollens inference to disprove at least one of God's omniqualities. So if we were to basically rearrange this argument, we can have something along the following. So we'll keep the first premise, but then we can move on to the other premises and say, well, look, we can turn it into a conditional statement and say, if God is omni-P, omni-B, omni-S for short, if he's all of these beings, then evil shouldn't exist. But then we have that evil does exist. And so, therefore, God is not an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and an omniscient being, just in virtue of a modus tollens inference here. In other words, the logical problem of evil can be used as a modus tollens to basically say that he's not all three at the same time. At the very least, one of these omniqualities are lacking. And as we go throughout the presentation, it is going to become very obvious that I am going to deny the second of these omniqualities, namely God's omnibenevolence. Most atheistic philosophers will actually go down the denying the omnipotence route. Rarely do we see people go down the omniscient route, but for this specific presentation, I'll go down the denying the omnibenevolent route. Okay, so in regards to that reformulized logical problem of evil, this is basically where Plantinga's free will defense basically comes in. Don't worry, I am going to give basically a quote from his book, Nature of Necessity from 1974, but I will give a more logical structure to what he says. But in reference to the book, this is basically what he tells us. And I kind of highlight, I think, the more important parts to his little summarization of basically the free will defense. So this is what he says. God can create free creatures, but he can't cause or determine them to do only what's right. Because if he does so, then they aren't significantly free after all. They don't do what is right freely. And to create creatures capable of moral good, therefore, he must create creatures capable of moral evil, and he can't give these creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. As it turns out, sadly enough, some of the free creatures God created went wrong in the exercise of their freedom, and this is the source of moral evil. And the fact that free creatures sometimes go wrong, however, counts neither against God's omnipotence nor against his goodness, for he could have forestalled the occurrence of moral evil only by removing the possibility of moral good. So I attempt to basically systematize this entire summarization, his basic free will defense, into more premises and conclusions, starting off with the fact that human beings, they're just among the creatures with significant free will. And I suppose before we further go into it, we ought to need to define what significant free will is. And what I think Plantinga is referring to is that given a certain circumstance, we have all, in reference to all the readily available options that are given to us, they necessarily exhaust all of the possible options in that circumstance, or at the very least, we're rendered accessible to a big majority of the possible options. And this is made to contrast with being or having a choice between only a limited subset. So you can imagine for a given possible situation, we can have 10 possible options. Significant free will would call for all 10 being accessible and not just 1 to 2. In that case, that wouldn't be significant free will. I mean, we still have some sort of free will, but it's not significant in the sense that Plantinga wants it to be. And you can see that he actually makes this move for moral choices as well. I think that it's actually not a good solution to have a response where we can say that perhaps God can limit our choices only from 1 to 2 instead of 1 to 10, because we could just say again that isn't significant free will. There is free will there, but it's just not significant enough. So this is what we mean by when we refer to significant free will, and then we can further basically systematize Plantinga's free will defense by saying that creatures with significant free will can, at the very least, sometimes, not all the time, choose to exercise their freedom wrongly. And more premises that wrong exercise and freedom is the source of evil. And even though God wants to, he can't take away evil without taking away significant free will. And more about Plantinga's summarization there, we notice that he uses the words he can't do this, he can't do that. And so this is where this premise basically highlights that even though God is omnipotent, we can't expect him to be able to do literally anything. For instance, there exists such things as logical contradictions that, even God just can't do that. For example, he can't create square circles. So there needs to be a sort of realm here where we can talk about his omnipotence removed from logical contradictions. And the sixth premise that we can have is that he can't create beings with significant free will that would never choose evil as a consequence, I suppose, of the fourth premise. And so as a conclusion, evil necessarily, at least, must be allowed to exist while we maintain God's omniqualities. If we recall, Plantinga basically says it neither counts against his omnipotence or his omnibenevolence, the existence of evil. And so this is at least my formulation of Plantinga's free will defense in a nutshell. And so I actually just have bits and pieces to say about each of these different premises. And I'm going to come to the conclusion that the fourth premise that I've listed is perhaps the most contentious one, and it is going to be the route that I'm going to go down on. I'm okay with the first premise, and by virtue, I suppose, premises 2 and 3. I do want to maintain free will. I don't want to go down the determinist route. So I actually do agree with the fifth premise as well, that I'll just take for the fact that logical contradictions are just a no-go, even for God, even though that is in itself contentious. Maybe if God really is omnipotent, then he could get around logical contradictions. But again, I'm not going to go down that route. And so in virtue, I basically just have a problem with namely premise 4 here, not barring anything else about what we've said about all the other premises, but this is the highlight of the contentiousness that I have against the entire formulation of Plantinga's free will defense. And when we think about what that means, when we say, oh, even though he wants to, he can't take away evil without taking away significant free will, I think we've been assuming something thus far that we haven't really gone into, and namely what it means when we talk about evil. And so I want to turn our discussion to a conversation about that word, evil, and what it means. And so we can have a couple of definitions of evil, but namely, we have to distinguish it from wrongness in general. So evil does involve wrongness, but it's not the same thing. A research fellow at the University of Manchester, Eve Gerard, gives an explicit definition of what we might mean by evil. And she basically says that evil can't be equated to just about any ordinary wrongdoing. And what she says specifically is that there's a qualitative and not merely a quantitative difference between evil acts and merely wrongful ones. And that evil acts are not just very bad or wrongful acts, but rather ones possessing some especially horrific quality. More people contributed to this definition of evil. One in particular, Todd Coulter, from the as an assistant professor at St. Mary's University, he says that evil is a sort of infliction of significant harm without good justification. And I guess we can distinguish here between cases like infidelity or murder. I think murder or brutal murder in the scenario that I purport to give here is that we can say that there's a especially horrifying quality that's present in the latter that just isn't present in infidelity. We can obviously assume that both are wrong acts and both of them are bad. It's just that one of these carries with it a certain grievousness, a certain seriousness that the other doesn't have. And so when we mean by evil, this is the kind of evil that we're talking about going forward with the rest of the presentation. And it's also important, I think, to have a discussion about the two kinds of readings of evil that we can have. It so far seems like we are focused on a sort of deontological reading of evil, where we focus on the action of evil itself. We focus on acts of evil. But I think what's missing from the conversation is a sort of conversation that talks about a consequentialist reading of evil, which is a sort of consequence-based evil. It focuses on the aftermaths, I suppose, of evil acts. And I suppose, given what acts and consequences, the relationship, we can say that deontological evil or consequentialist evil just follows from deontological evil, but they're nevertheless separate entities, or nevertheless separate readings, rather. And we can actually see that the definition of evil that we've just previously went over, they're compatible with both readings. Obviously, we say that we can call, let's take our first definition of evil, to say that an act is a especially horrifying act. But we can also say that about the consequences and say something like, did you hear what happened when someone did something this? Oh, that's horrifying. So we're referring to the sort of aftermaths of evil actions as well. So they are compatible with both readings, I think. So with that underway, we can actually get into the start of our pushback in terms of Plantinga's free will defense. So let's turn back to the fourth premise that I mainly have a problem with, namely that even though God wants to, he can't take away evil without taking away SFW, significant free will. I suppose I'll just acronymize it going forward. And we can basically just say, we can rephrase this to say that God can't prevent any evil without taking away significant free will. So I've basically made into a universalized claim, and now what I want to do is to basically negate that claim. And it's to show that God actually can, at least sometimes, prevent evils without taking away significant free will. And so that is how we negate universal claims, right? It's to just show at least one example where that doesn't hold. And that's what I purport to do with this next example, when we talk about this prevention of evil, at least sometimes, and whilst preserving free will. And so I actually think that as it stands, Plantinga's got me on the deontological reading of evil. I mean, I'm under the deontological reading, we can't prevent evil and preserve free will at the same time. Given the nature of what it means to be a significant free will act, however, we can actually have these cases where we can prevent evil and preserve free will under the consequentialist reading of evil, when we say that there's evil consequences. And we can use a sort of ambulance analogy or like an EMS analogy or any sort of analogy that involves like healthcare practitioners, doctors, nurses, anything. So what I want to focus on is that I admit, Plantinga's got me on this one, that God can't stop evil acts without removing significant free will. And this is just our deontological reading. But God can stop their consequences, or what follows from them, without removing significant free will. So this is where the sort of analogy comes from, this ambulance analogy, to be very derivative, but it gets the point across. So we can think of it like an ambulance or EMS, where they can't prevent evil from happening in the first place, but they do have the capacity to respond to it in full. And this is basically the move that I expect God to be able to do under a consequentialist reading of evil. This is something that he can do, given that he's omnipotent, if not better, seeing as how, because he's omnipotent, he can do this perfectly, instead of, maybe EMS or doctors and nurses not being able to save someone on time from an evil act. And this is basically the crux of my entire argument as to how we can basically see how we can tear apart Plantinga's free will defense. And we can see, actually, if we go back to our definition of evil, whenever we talk about significant free will, I think my ambulance analogy sort of works, because it's focusing on consequentialist evil and not a sort of deontological reading of evil. And so significant free will isn't touched at all by it, because we're not talking about deontological evil, right? But significant free will is only contained by the deontological. It's contained only in actions and fully describable through actions alone. And so we can get behind this intuition when we talk about various cases of significant free will. Whenever we say things like, oh, that was a free choice, or they committed a free act, or I made a freely made decision. But it seems kind of weird to talk about free will in terms of consequences, like free consequence. What would that look like? So I think that's actually the reason why we're able to make this move, this sort of ambulance analogy, because we're focusing now on the consequences, but not touching anything at all about the significant free will that is strictly contained in the act itself. So we're not touching that part. And so this is where at least my rebuttal comes in. So depending on the reading of evil, of course, this is where the asterisk comes from. There is at least no more logical contradiction between removing evil and preserving significant free will. At the very least, sometimes, right, we can do that. So because he's omnipotent, God can now take away evil without taking away significant free will, at least sometimes. And further premises. So the ones that we've had so far, God is purportedly also an omnibenevolent being. And if he's both omnipotent and an omnibenevolent, then evil wouldn't exist. But as it turns out, evil does exist. And now we can make some logic rules here and say that he's not both omnipotent and omnibenevolent. If we take the third and fourth premises together, we can again just modus tollens rules of inference this to say that he's not both of those things. And even more logic rules, we can use De Morgan's law to say, well, he's either not omnipotent or not omnibenevolent. But we have just taken that he is omnipotent. So clearly we've eliminated that possibility. So we're just left with the fact that he's not omnibenevolent. And this is just a modus tollendo ponens, a very last rule of inference here, to get us to that conclusion. And I should say, I think I would expect some objections towards that fourth premise. I myself say that sometimes God can intervene. So it is actually still possible that evil does exist. So I suppose we can reformulate this fourth premise into saying the same amount of evil exists when he could remove at least some. And so now everything still follows suit. And it leads us to the conclusion that he's just not omnibenevolent. I suppose for all of the logic buffs out there, and this is what it would sort of look like if you were taking symbolic logic of the sorts. And so we're basically just led to the conclusion of Dystheism, which is basically our last conclusion, which is that God is not omnibenevolent. And so this Dystheism is basically the belief or taking on of attitudes that God is not a wholly good God. And so, like, we can adopt dystheistic attitudes when we believe that God is not a wholly good God. And we can also say maybe perhaps he's careless or indifferent. And this would also fall under this set of dystheism, this belief. And this is all from the motivation that, the same amount of evil exists when he could remove at least some. And we know that he can because he's omnipotent. So we've eliminated that possibility. So he's concluding with the fact that he's just not omnibenevolent. And we can actually think of dystheism as a thing that exists, right? The concept of gods, or on the more morally dubious spectrum, is a concept that's existed, sometime before Christian or Catholic gods. And I see no reason to continue the conversation of a morally dubious god with a Christian god. There's a specific example of Loki here, right? In Norse mythology, a trickster god who is not wholly good. And we can even have other examples, like Eshu in Yoruban mythology, who is also another trickster god who literally, deliberately tries to mess with people and get them into conflict solely because he loves to do so. And there's also god of darkness and evil in Zoroastrianism. And we can also even talk about Odin, who was the god of frenzy. So clearly that's not an entirely wholly good god here. But I don't mean to say that it's not to say that God is necessarily privy to all of these things. It's just to bring out our intuition that gods, they really can be, not wholly good, and that this isn't too much of an alienating concept because it's been thought of before. And that I think that dystheism is a perfectly acceptable conclusion to come to with the current state of affairs and what's going on in the world. And so thank you, everyone, for listening to my presentation.
Well, thank you so much for this. I love discussions of dystheism because one of my areas of specialization is misotheism, the hatred of God. And one of the big reasons that misotheism exists at all is because of the conclusion that God must not be good. And therefore it is immoral to worship or revere such an evil deity or an indifferent deity.
Right.
Now, this is what I find interesting. You didn't get to see it today, so I will encourage you to go back and take a look at Dr. David Eller's presentation earlier today, where he talked about how the majority of deities in human history have not been good and were never seen as that. And it's that it is okay for that. It is kind of a uniquely, relatively recent view of God that he is incapable of evil or wickedness, or that he isn't just as prone to the same type of wrongful actions and motivations as any other human is. I guess right off the bat, though, I want to ask, why was your argument to when dismantling Plantinga's free will, is the argument already assuming that God must exist and therefore what are my possible options? Or did you consider, instead of dystheism as a conclusion, coming to the atheism conclusion, which is God just doesn't exist at all?
Right. I actually wanted to go down a route where even if you were atheist or if you were a religious practitioner, you could actually get behind this theory of dystheism. I think it could apply to both. But I think that I didn't want to focus on atheism as a conclusion, mainly because you could say that there's a brilliant example.
One last thing you might want to know is that the Global Center for Religious Research has established the most comprehensive international research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. But we have a big problem. See, in order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is recognized as a real mental health condition. And unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma is still in its infancy. This means that there are no exhaustive empirical studies to support what we have seen and experienced, that religious trauma exists and is a chronic problem. As it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published so far, but nothing substantially empirical. And GCRR wants to correct this gap of knowledge, and we're hoping to get your help with that. So we have set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first, most comprehensive sociological study on the existence, causes, and manifestations of religious trauma. Now, the reason we are crowdsourcing this stuff is because we were actually set to get a grant, federal grant for this research project, and then the federal government halted all funding for mental health research. So we were left holding the bag. That's why we're hoping the public can join us in this effort. All you have to do is go to GoFundMe.com and search for the phrase religious trauma sociological study, or you can click the link that I'm going to put in the chat box. And at the very least, please share this GoFundMe page across all your social media platforms just to get the word out about this really important research project.